My friend and I, Jake, are both outdoor enthusiasts. We try to take each and every moment we can to be outside. Jake and I have been best friends since we were about 5 years old. Our families also happen to be friends. It was our senior year in high school. Jake and I decided to pick a random spot out in the middle of the woods and go camping. We really didn't do much research on where we were camping. There were probably times we were on someone's property and we just didn't know it. Thankfully, we lived in a small town where everyone knew everyone. Jake and I packed up my truck on Thursday night. That way, after school on Friday, we could just take off and go camping. We really didn't have a spot in mind. We just knew that we wanted to be away from civilization and deep in the woods. We parked our car near the local nature trail, and we started our hike into the woods. We did our best to make sure that no one followed us. Technically, we weren't supposed to be camping out here, but then again, we've never had issues before. During our hike on the trail, we were able to see an old abandoned railroad that led off into the deep woods. We then decided to leave the well-paved trail and follow the railroad instead. About 15 minutes on this railroad, we came to an astonishing sight. The train tracks led us to a tunnel that was carved into a hill. The tunnel looked dark and ominous. I wanted nothing to do with this tunnel. However, it was getting dark and our camping gear was pretty heavy. We decided to backtrack a little bit and find a small clearing in the woods, but the tunnel was still visible from our campsite, which kinda made me uneasy. Jake and I were able to set up camp and start a campfire in under 15 minutes. I guess that's what you get when you've done this all your life. The campfire lit a small perimeter, about 20 feet or so, around our campsite, leaving everything else in darkness. Jake and I do what we normally do when we go camping. We tell scary stories and jokes and just have a good time all around. For some reason, a reason I can't explain, I felt the urge to turn on my flashlight and point it towards the tunnel. But despite the urges, I didn't do it. A part of me was afraid that Jake would have thought I was afraid or something if I shined my light over there. But I think the biggest reason was that I was afraid of what I was going to see. It was getting quite late and I was telling my favorite ghost story to Jake when something surprising happened. In the middle of my story, Jake stood up and turned his flashlight on, pointing it to the tunnel behind us. He didn't say anything for a good 10 seconds. He just stood there, back facing me. "Hey man, are you good?" I asked him. "Yeah, I just had this weird feeling," he responds. I didn't mention to Jake that I also had that weird feeling to turn my light on and point it towards the tunnel. Instead, I just stood next to him, looking at the tunnel. I don't know what we were expecting to see, a ghost or an evil alien clown trying to kill us, but we saw nothing. We both sat down after a minute or so, and I finished my story. Instead of responding with a more scarier story, Jake just sat quietly and looked at the fire. I did the same. We just stared at the campfire until the fire died. For some reason, Jake and I both felt more safe with the campfire out. It was as if we were no longer visible to the creatures of the darkness. Not much later, we decided that it was time for bed. While we were getting ready for bed and going to the bathroom for the last time, we heard something strange come from the tunnel. We could hear what sounded like the echoing of a voice coming from deep within the tunnel. We couldn't tell if it was male or female, but we really didn't want to find out. Despite not being that far away, we were pretty well covered with the trees and brush in our area. Even if anyone had a flashlight, it still would be somewhat difficult to find us. However, with our well-covered campsite, I still debated whether or not to leave. Jake looked at me and he looked terrified. "Dude, we need to leave," he said. As terrifying as this was, I was also annoyed. We just hiked about an hour out into the woods and set up camp. I don't want to have to hike all the way back. Jake said that we could leave our stuff and come back for it later. After a few minutes of mulling it over, I finally agreed. We quietly left our campsite, trying our best not to turn on our flashlights, and continued down the railroad, away from the tunnel. While we were walking away from the tunnel, the sounds and echoes we were hearing were getting louder. Not only were they getting louder, but it sounded as if whatever it was screaming. Thankfully at this point, we were a good distance away that we could turn on our flashlight. We were able to find the trail after a few minutes of looking, to which we were able to make it back to my truck. We just drove home to my house and we stayed the night there. Early the next morning, we decided to hike back out to our old campsite in order to get our stuff back. This time on our hike, we were not encumbered with our camping stuff, so the hike was much quicker. We found the railroad much more quickly this time, and we were able to follow it to our campsite, or should I say, what remained. To our horror, the campsite was utterly destroyed. Our tent was completely thrashed, and all of our stuff was scattered. It didn't look like anything was taken or stolen, just destroyed. It looked like whoever did this was either a person with a knife or a creature with very large claws. We were able to see the tracks of whatever did this was indeed not human. The tracks circled our campsite a couple of times before coming in and destroying everything. Since we were not able to recover anything, we decided to turn around and get back on the trail, running back to my truck. Looking back, I'd hate to imagine what would happen if me and Jake were to stay the night. There is no doubt that Jake saved my life. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was an isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on Bear Creek. I don't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of the wide fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centered, very community-centered. All the young girls, myself included, were a part of young women's group, and all the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows outside of the irrigated fields besides sagebrush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of the thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we used to go down to the bottoms and pick the white cotton pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter. And the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer when I turned 8, I remember because it was the same year as my baptism. A smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farm and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. The same summer, my neighbor Peyton was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try to put together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided to try and get pictures of the lion and email the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in the area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting some kind of bait so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carrion, so they came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on a loop throughout a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as almost being identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and the recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first, I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived home that night and he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to go check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everyone kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night, I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight up in my bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clutched so hard my palms bore the indent of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But that was impossible, because the recording had been going on all night the previous day, and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning, I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mom and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Mom was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise farther than it normally reached. He told us to listen. We did. He was right. We couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night, it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time, something was different. It was a lower pitch than I remember, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times, the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at random places in the middle. My mom didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night, I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into my front yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise slid in through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred the branches. My mom announced that she'd be going to visit her sister in town the next day and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was Daddy's girl at heart and chose to stay at the farm. I took Mom's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noises during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hairs on my back of my neck pricked. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop, just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who'd been missing since that morning. Dad said he was sorry and that we hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording, but he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mom stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screamings were thin and long. Other times they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose in such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and shattered it. I pressed my hands over my ears where I sat at the table and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise forced itself through the cracks of my fingers, pinched my throat, and rattled my ribcage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross into our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Peyton coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the cameras and speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dripped from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Peyton couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Peyton as both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it up, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal. Just the pussy willow cast screen and the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point, the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained on for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted like an animal, and it seemed to have difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was, it must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalps removed. Then a cat, then more cats, then a dog, the yellow lab, then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and the lion all laid out in a row facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged in a way as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellow and crusty, and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth. Sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gums between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said that the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night. Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends, and now they're gone. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did, and it'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now, and I'm only left with memories of them. I'm sorry for being maudlin and bringing everyone down, but I think this is the only way I can really introduce my story and explain why I feel like I have to type this out. I think that writing this is the only way that I can learn to accept that. I'll try to keep these downer tendencies to myself as I'm writing all of this down, but I can't make any promises. I know that being the third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse, being a fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, your group is a semi-functional tricycle. If you're a fifth wheel, you're left as some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or cares about. Imagine not being able to follow the in-jokes and shared history of one couple and multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. That was the frame of mind I had as we all piled into Ian's car to go to the Gila National Forest for our hike. I know that was a weird opening to give to all of this after my depressing opening, but I want all of you to have an idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure how to describe all of this, but I do know that I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened and help me come to terms with it all. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this would be to help you see from my perspective as much as possible. So, there we were, driving down to the Gia for a hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel wedged between two of Ian's friends, who I didn't know. 3 of us were crammed in the back seat while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at that unnecessary bit of moping back in August 2016 as one of the last few moments of normalcy I will have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did. Ian was always the more social of us. Our mom used to tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend, that I kept them. It was one of those parental platitudes that was given to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would take me almost 19 years to learn that that wasn't true. Instead of taking therapist diagnosis of social anxiety disorder, following a breakdown after an office get-together as a means for seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself off from the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working, and I told myself I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that wasn't healthy, and convinced me to go on a week-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday after taking the day off of work that I saw that he invited others along. I think he saw it as means of getting me help and breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I liked being in my shell. It was comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction where I caught no one's name except for those I already knew, my brother and his girlfriend, Jessica, due to the morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, we packed up the car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the other sleepiness killed him off fairly quickly. We found the parking lot near the Gielit Cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we took a moment to bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town into the face of a cliff, but 700 years ago people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty, except for us, we would find out why later, and I was in need of some social lubrication. We split a 6-pack of beer, and I took in the majesty. Here's a picture in case you were wondering what the area looked like. As we finished our beers, we got everything prepared, and used the restrooms. Ian explained that the path that we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the West Fork Trail had been closed all summer due to flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not to clear it due to the recent floodings, so it'd be a bit more like a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous in itself, it did keep us from encountering other hikers, which would cause us a lot of problems when we actually needed help. Ian figured that we could make about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and we would be able to complete the Gila Loop, which was about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday, with no one any wiser that we'd backpacked a closed section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't recall clearly, I opted to include a picture rather than spend a page writing out everything. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path that we were taking. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the entire area so you can orient yourself if you want to trace the trail we took. If you plan on following along with the path as I tell you about this experience, all I can say is, good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost now as I was then. I was just going along with the group and trying to keep a positive mindset about everything. I wanted to try and do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends better. I think that my circumstances had finally began to set in. I had been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year, and I had no friends. I would go to work, and then go home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend the entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I knew that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm, and that frightened me. Our first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time taking in the sights, soaking in the sun, and breathing the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upward. As I was unaccustomed to hiking, I frequently fell behind, but I never completely lost sight of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of a tree whose bark looked like dried scales from some long-dead alligator, I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they've been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get the conversation going a few sentences before it shivered up and died. I remember assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before continuing our ascent up the mesa. This is where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was here. The path up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting and wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. They seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this sort of thing for years. By the time our path started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until we reached the top and looked out over everything that I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was going or what trail markers we had been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and tromping through poison ivy, bumbling into rapey gangs of banjo-playing hill folk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering in circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, where was I going to go? Would I go back home to my empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, and feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of Indian Creek after having hiked a decent amount. Ian was confident that we'd make it back on Sunday, and that the next few days were going to be less intensive. We ate some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag away from camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of the campfire we had built when the conversation shifted to the most awkward moments everyone had experienced. Ian retold his story about the first time he met Jessica at a club where he was way too drunk for his own good and ended up puking on her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an a-hole for that. Each person shared their story about bumbling first kiss where their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm rooms in underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked into their favorite bag. Then the bottle came to me, and it was my turn to tell them a story. I instantly knew what the most embarrassing story was the moment we started the conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story about ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview that I'd probably ripped straight from the 90s sitcom. They laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of crap. They had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experiences, and here I was too afraid to tell them the truth, to tell them about the door. The conversation continued for a bit afterwards as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we had all went to bed still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom, still a bit fuzzy from the bullet whiskey. I tromped off into the woods to do my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me had I not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter back around camp. She told me that she had dropped hers, and she asked me to help look for it. But I was too out of it to be good to anyone, so I told her that we'd look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling a protest as I stumbled back into my sleeping roll. It wasn't until I woke up the next morning that I realized how stupid I'd been. Apparently, they had heard yowling in the surrounding woods all last night. They thought that the sound could have possibly belonged to a Mexican gray wolf, but no one knew for sure. Ian knew that they inhabited the area, but were very uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out into the woods to answer the call of nature. We packed up a while later after a light breakfast and continued on our hike. The second day was a little better. The overbearing sun I suffered previously was hidden behind heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157-729 junction. We went along the Little Bear Canyon as we headed towards the TJ Coral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, and despite nursing a slight hangover, I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack and clunky boots my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from the nearby river, boiling and adding iodine tablets to them, as the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think that maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and yelling wolves added a bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't much joking around or conversations this night. We talked a little bit, but mainly just had something small to eat while we stared into the campfire. Ian and Jessica were the first to call it a night. I stayed up with the others for a bit, but they were mainly silent. The other two slowly went off after a bit, and I decided to enjoy the warmth a little bit longer before getting ready to go to bed for the night. Just as I finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up and asking me for the map. He told me he wanted to plan out the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit that wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier the longer he searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the pack for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear out his own hair, and it seemed like he had spent the entire morning looking for that one thing, wanting to know what was up. I walked up to him and started talking. He asked me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." "Where's Gary?" I gave him the map last night so he could map out a little detour on the trip so we could visit a spring. "Why don't you ask him? He probably knows," I answered. It was then that Ian said something that changed everything. "Gary? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell you thought his name was..." I explained, "No, I was talking about Gary. Tall guy, kinda lanky." "You're joking, right?" He looked confused for a few seconds and made a questioning sound, like a really old computer trying to process something before it catches fire. The pieces clicked and Ian shouted, "Who the F is Gary?" getting attention of everyone in the area. "He was... Some effing guy asked you for a map in the middle of the night and you just effing give it to him? You handed someone our stuff to some random stranger you just met in the woods?" I tried to explain myself and tell him that I knew Gary, and that he did too since I remember hiking with him the day before, but I couldn't find the words to convey that point. It was here that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on. Ian vented vitriol. "How effing stupid are you even? Some random guy, Gary, comes up to you in the middle of the night asking you for our stuff and you just give it to him? Jeez, dude, we need to get that map to get around smoothly since the trails out here haven't been cleared." Ian shouted for about 15 minutes while everyone became aware of the situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough to figure out what our next move was. While we weren't completely screwed, as Ian had memorized a large portion of trail markers, it was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back around to our car. We packed up all of our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike, I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I'd seen him this furious was just before he got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him into a pulp. He got suspended for a week and Aaron got a black eye, busted lip, and never said anything about her mother again. Each time we came across a break in the path, we spent a few minutes while Ian tried to remember where to go. The fact that the trail had been closed and the paths were overgrown only served to make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering on the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where things went wrong since we didn't have the map at that time, but that's my best guess, further away from home and safety. Towards midday, tensions had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation by telling everyone that we just had to follow the compass and that we'd get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as she walked. I think she had the right idea since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he'd downed a fifth of vodka and was trying to walk a tightrope while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. The realization twisted something deep down inside and made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and began talking to Lucas. "What's going on with you, man?" Ian, still pissed off at me, took this opportunity to vent a bit. "Huh? What are you talking about now?" Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. "What's wrong with..." "Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike started about his condition." As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me, clear as day. I recall Ian pulling me to the side and telling me about his friend's diagnosis, and how this was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this, so we had to help him and move slowly. I remember watching him scramble up the trail and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from hospital beds, and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night when she thought we were asleep. Guilt flooded over me, and I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled at me the instant I stepped forward, and he dropped to a hunched position on his hands and feet. It almost looked like his skin was bristling at the possible threat, and I could see his broken and decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us, before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from the last Planet of the Apes movie. His shaky and unstable balance was replaced by a more natural and animalistic gait as he lopped into the distance and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were his clothes, sloughing off his body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk. What the f... As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch had flipped that set everyone to panic mode. We began to run along the trail as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think it took a good 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with heavy packs and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breath, I surveyed the area around us and came to the terrible realization. In our panic, we had just run off the path and we were now even deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over. What the hell was that? The short answer was that it was Lucas. The long of it is this: there was no Lucas. Not really. I'm sorry for interrupting the story in the middle like this, but I think it's now the best time to try to explain everything. I know how confusing this all seems with Gary and Lucas. The truth is, I did that because I don't think I could have appropriately explained it to you without the first experiencing it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memories. They wrap themselves up in a wall of your recollections, and even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of 4 friends could grow into 5, and you wouldn't be any wiser. A part of you will stupidly admonish you for ever wondering how many there were. You look at it and you recognize the face. You remember events. You remember getting drunk at a bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it is true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls into your head somehow and makes you see things in ways that benefits them. It can mold memories, but it can't mimic human movement. It walks on 4 claws, not 2 feet. It growls, hisses, and snarls. It doesn't talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It was hunting us, and was trying to drive us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never really reached much of a conclusion about what that thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of there as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. He didn't tell the others. I think he realized that panicking would only get us in more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hoped it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals yowling and calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same noises that they had heard the first night out in the woods. Whatever that thing was, it was following us and calling out to the other things in the area. At the time, I couldn't stop thinking about one of them, barreling out from the underbrush and sinking its black and rotten teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us here, and we had only actually encountered one of those creatures. As the day pressed on and we seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot, I couldn't help but shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It felt like I'd forgotten some important deadline that I should never have forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned that he wished of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned towards her, but knew what was coming the second she asked. We only took 1 car down, right? Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated. Of course we did. Remember how we crammed everyone in that tiny-ass Prius with all of our camping gear smashed in the trunk and on our laps? What about it? Jessica went white, as if this was the first time that Ian had ever raised his voice at her. She paused for a moment before asking, "How many of us are here right now, and how many does our car seat?" Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably, and there were 6 of us out in the woods at that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore. Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek and half gasp, while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong there. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something, and that was, "'Tis me, sugar." She hadn't finished her own words before her jaw popped open. I don't mean that it dropped open like she was astonished at something. It popped open like it was dislocated from her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sickly pink void of inflamed gums that was at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised a twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place with a hollow-sounding squelch of meat and bone shifting as if nothing was wrong about what had just happened before she tried to speak again. "It's me?" Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards the failed facsimile of a human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing, "Get out of here!" She hopped back from the attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all 4s. Her body shuddered as if an electric jolt had just passed through her as she slowly backed away from all of us while facing Jessica the entire time. She hissed at us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a convulsive lope. It took a moment for all of us to regain our composure before we continued walking while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him, "Do you see how it moved?" It was twitching like an epileptic in a rave. You ever see one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing was twitching and moving like one of those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person can do that to their body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried that the thing could hear us, but really that wasn't the case. We made him stop talking because it only served to scare us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around the campfire and listened to the sound of high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got close to falling asleep, the calls would start up and jolt me wide awake. We spoke in hushed whispers and tried to figure out what they wanted with us, though none of us really wanted to answer that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around and trying to find a familiar sight, without any real sense of where we were and where we were going. Our only hope was to stumble across another hiker or find an area with a high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations that we climbed didn't afford us a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we'd find another hiker due to the fact that the trail had been closed and wasn't cleared. Even if we did, what were the chances that we would trust them, and that we could be certain that it wasn't one of those things? Midway through the day, Ian whispered to me, "Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us again." I casually looked over my shoulder and noticed that one of our group was walking without any gear. They trailed behind us, but were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly, but didn't show any kind of jerky movements of the previous 2. The thought that it was learning to mimic our movements unsettled me. Without really thinking, I shoved off my backpack and approached the imposter. Before they knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant my hand pressed onto their shirt, I felt something slick and warm give away like the outer layer falling off of a rotten mango. Their shirt slid off their bodies into my hand, and I quickly realized it was their skin. The thing was actually naked, but gave the appearance of clothes by altering the color of its almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin that sloughed off and hit the ground with a wet slap. The creature toppled backwards and began yelping. I can only describe the sound like this. Imagine getting out of your bed in the middle of the night to take a piss. As you are feeling your way through the darkness to get out of your room, you step on your dog's tail. Imagine that surprised yelp of pain and that surprise that comes along with it. Now focus on that emotion you felt when you heard that noise, that sudden surprise and guilt. In reality, the sound it made was nothing like a hurt dog. It just reminded me so much of a wounded pet that I couldn't differentiate the sounds. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking and tormenting us. They were like hunting us, and I felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to, and so I did. The thing writhed on the ground on its back for a few seconds, making a pitiable noise. It reached back with its arms and pushed itself upright on its hands and balls of its feet. Its joints popped wetly, and its muscles and bones adjusted to fit its new position. It crab-crawled away while shrieking the entire time as Ian pursued it with his walking stick, hoping to catch up to it to cave its head in. It wasn't until the thing disappeared from sight that I realized that the shrieking just wasn't coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone and Jessica's screams possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided that I had to do something. I stepped forward and I wrapped her up in my arms. She was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered that it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out was that something was terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down as I told her that everything was going to be alright. I didn't believe that myself, but it was the only thing that I could think of that might bring her comfort. Ian returned fuming that the monster had escaped, and I awkwardly broke off the hug. Ian didn't say anything. He just started walking. We continued following him, hoping that he would find the way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. 6 hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like we'd been going in circles all day and made absolutely no progress. For all we knew, the thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were new and leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things wanted with us. They wanted to lead us deeper into the woods. They were trying to force us to exhaustion, and we were too weak to defend ourselves. They would descend upon us and eat us. Oliver was right about that. If this thing is similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were likely some sort of prion disorder that came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided against having a fire and drawing more of them to us, we reached the conclusion that we'd have to sleep in shifts. I volunteered for first watch, because my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me of any desire to sleep. The others went off without so much as another word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour into my watch that I realized that I was too. Even given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needed sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after our encounter with the creature. I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible that others hadn't. We talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought was going on and how everyone was handling it. She was worried about Ian. She confessed that he was acting erratic and that was scaring her. I wrapped my arms around her for a moment and told her that we were all scared. She looked into my eyes and told me that she was glad I was here, and I felt something twist deep down inside me that I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on watch, the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that she and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and she was wondering if they were going to work it all out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together. He made her feel wonderful, but there was something that didn't feel right, like there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life, and I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it. I had to tell her about the door. She listened quietly as I told her everything. It was the event that precipitated my breakdown at work and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis at the therapist's office. Everything started off simply enough one Friday at work. I was in the lunchroom eating my sandwich and reading a book. As per usual, while my coworkers talked about their plans for the weekend, one of them was having a housewarming party and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured that the invitation was only extended to the people he was talking to, until he asked me if I was able to make it on Saturday. As it was the first time I had been invited to hang out after work, I chose to go. I spent all of Saturday getting ready, planning what were interesting topics to bring up in case there was a lull in conversation, and the bottle of wine I was planning to give as a housewarming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand and my spirits high. I convinced myself that I was going to be the life of the party, and that maybe if I played my cards right, I could finally find a friend at work that would make the time fly by instead of dragging on. It wasn't until I reached the house that the false bravado began to crumble apart. I stopped in front of the neighbor's house, as everywhere else already had a car parked there. It was then that I felt my heart beating like I had just run a mile. I began heading up the driveway with the wine bottle slick in my hands, from my palms sweating. It wasn't until I reached the front door that I realized that something was terribly wrong. All that excitement that had been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else: apprehension. All those topics I had thought up seemed boring, and all those reassurances I had given myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for this at all. At this point, a small part of me whispered something that had stuck with me to this very day. That voice intimated that they never really wanted me to come out. They had only given me that invitation as a courtesy, and didn't actually expect me to come out to their house. It said that if I knocked on that door, that I would be making a fool out of myself. It told me that I wasn't even comfortable in my own skin, so how could I even dare to imagine that they would enjoy my company? They wanted to celebrate with their friends. They didn't want to listen to me fumble for something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding that I knock on that door and make myself look like an idiot. The part of me told me that I was better off alone, and I listened. I turned around without even knocking on the door, and I left. No one had come in, and the music was playing loudly, so I doubt that they would have even heard me anyways. I shouldn't have even been there in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing at me as I drove away, flustered and embarrassed. Maybe they went back to the party and joked about the social retard who had seemingly freaked out and ran away from their own house while I went home and cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told her the story. She smiled sadly as I started to cry into her shoulder. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All that fear, foolishness, and fatalistic failure smashed into me like a wave on the shore. She whispered soothing words into my ear and waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was there, under the moonlight with her face inches away from mine, that I did the worst thing I'd ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked into her eyes and I saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her as she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me, while telling her all the things I should have said when I first met her and realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid that if I let her go, I'd lose this perfect moment. She was warm. She smelled like wildflowers. She smelled like happiness. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt comfortable and content. I don't know when I drifted off, but I do remember waking up. In the love-drunk excitement of the previous night, I didn't think once about Ian or the consequences of my decision. I only thought about Jessica, and I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. I convinced her to cheat on him with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed she'd gone back to her sleeping role in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He rubbed the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night. The words bled out of me, and once they started, I couldn't stop. I don't know what happened, man. We were just talking one moment and then the next. Oh, jeez. I didn't mean for it to happen. You know I love you, man. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. It just happened, and now I can't take it back. Jessica's cry of surprise cut me off before I could go any further. Both me and Ian turned to the sound of her distress, and we knew instantly what had happened. The backpacks with our compass, food, and water had been stolen. It knew. Don't you see it? It knew that we could identify it without a backpack, and it couldn't shape its skin to take the appearance of one, so it stole them away from us. Now the next time it worms its way into our group, we wouldn't be any wiser. Jessica and I never talked that night. Jessica had never left my brother's side that night. They had zipped their sleeping rolls together. She didn't open up to me about any of her worries, and I never actually kissed her. I poured my heart out to that thing wearing Jessica's skin while it was in my arms. I confessed my truest feelings to an entity masquerading as a person. I felt sick. The others woke up quickly after hearing Jessica screaming. We quickly searched around the area, hoping to find some scraps of food or some indication of where stuff may have been taken to. We found nothing. It was long gone. We had no food, no water, and no hope. We had no way of telling which one of those things was hijacking our heads and pretending to be part of our group so it could distract us. With our compass gone, we had no means of following a set direction and hoping to pick the trail back up. In short, we were screwed with a capital S. Oliver demanded to know what I was doing last night. He wanted to know how I could be so careless as to fall asleep when I should have been watching over them and our gear. I lied, and I told him that someone had come around the middle of the night to relieve me of my shift. I didn't mention that it was one of those things impersonating Jessica. I couldn't bear to look at either my brother or his girlfriend in the eyes at that point. Oliver started to yell, but stopped when he saw I was on the verge of tears. I don't know if it was mercy or disgust that caused him to stop. It doesn't matter either way. We gathered up the only thing that they hadn't taken that night, our sleeping rolls, and continued walking. The hike without water or the prospect of food was unbearable. We were already exhausted, and the realization that we were soon going to be starving and dehydration only served to sap out more of our energy. Within a few hours, my mouth felt gummy and dry. While we were still under the canopy of leaves, the temperature was still in the high 80s and low 90s. It didn't take long for dehydration to set in. I kept licking my lips in an attempt to keep them moist, but I could feel them beginning to crack as my saliva began to dry up as well. As we walked, Oliver picked up his pace and caught up with me. I looked over at him and knew, without him saying anything, that one of those things had joined our group. He whispered, "Don't look directly at it. Just keep it in the corner of your eye. I think that's how it messes with your mind." It would explain why you'd remember that one guy that night, but the rest of us can't. You saw him, but the rest of us didn't. Don't get close. Just keep it in the corner of your eyes. It's been trailing us for half an hour now. I think it just wants to watch us and follow us. I pretended to be cracking my neck and looked at the tag-along in my peripheral vision. It trailed behind us about a dozen feet. It's in its resting state. Its facial features appeared staticky. I couldn't make out eyes and nose, but it was constantly shifting and rippling like bubbling plastic. At this point, we were too tired to even bother chasing it off. We just kept walking and hoped that it wouldn't try to join our group. It seemed content to keep its distance and keep us in its line of sight. It followed us for another 2 miles before it broke off towards the trees with a shambling, awkward gait. We were too tired to even try and set up a shift system. We just huddled together in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were safer when we were closer together. But every time one of us got comfortable enough to drift off, those things would start making noises. The noises started off as high-pitched yips, whose sound seemed to travel for miles. As the night drew on, they grew more aggressive. I remember one time as I was drifting off, hearing the grating rasp of my name, Evan. The things weren't just following us, they were learning. They were perfecting their mimicry. The thought disturbed me more than the idea of them out there, watching us in the darkness. How long would it take for them to become more human than human? What would they do once they were capable of walking amongst people again? I drifted off to sleep with that thought beating around in my head like a man trapped inside a wall. We got up on Tuesday morning and left without a word. At this point, there was nothing left to say. Some of us had been awake all night without any food or water. The constant stress had completely worn us down. We continued hiking in the same direction we'd been going, in the false hope that we'd come across someone. In the end, our hike looked more like a death march. My feet were covered in blisters that had ruptured and plastered the soles of my feet to my socks. Every step felt like I was tearing open the wounds a bit more. In an attempt to take my mind off the discomfort, I focused on my brother who was walking in front of me. He wasn't as much walking as he was limping forward. He stopped using his walking stick and was dragging it behind him like it was a broken limb. I watched as he stepped over a rock with the walking stick slipping out of his hands. He kept dragging himself forward as if nothing had happened. He didn't even register it falling out of his hands. It was at that point that I knew something was wrong. I knew that my brother wasn't my brother anymore. I quietly picked up his stick as I passed it. Amy went to call out to him and asked if he was alright, but I shushed her. I was so sure that one of those things had replaced him and was now leading us deeper into the woods. I realized that I'd only have one chance at this. The instant it knew that we knew, it would try to run away. All that it would take was one good swing to the back of its head, and we'd be able to take out one of those things. The stick had a bit of weight to it, about 5 or 6 pounds. Enough to crack open a skull if it was swung hard enough. I began walking faster while trying to avoid the underbrush that might give away my approach. The thing was wearing my brother's skin, continued limping forward as I drew closer. I waited until I was within swinging distance before raising the stick above my head. My heart was beating in my chest and my palms were so sweaty that it felt like the stick would slide right out of my hands. It kept moving on forwards, completely unaware of what I was about to do to it. I whispered, "I'm sorry," just before I swung the walking stick down with all my strength. Ian turned to face me as he mumbled groggily, "Sorry for what?" My muscles locked and I stopped mid-swing, and the stick stopped inches away from his face. He blinked in surprise before muttering, "Evan, what's wrong?" His voice sounded distant and empty, like he was in between a waking and sleep state. It was then that I knew the extent of his condition. He was pale and looked like the slightest breeze would blow him over. It wasn't one of those things. He was delirious from dehydration, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The walking stick fell out of my hands and bounced on the ground next to us. I dragged my tongue across my lips. It felt like I was licking sandpaper. I whimpered, "Geez, Ian, I thought you were one of those things. Oh, jeez. I'm so sorry." He didn't react to my apology. He just turned around and continued walking in the direction that we were going in. Amy just watched everything unfold numbly before she started following him. Oliver shook his head sadly, but he didn't look any better. His eyes were glazed and his lips were cracking and red from rubbing them. I watched my brother shambling forward, and it reminded me of one of those old voodoo movies where someone is put into a trance and forced to work until they die from exhaustion. His mouth hung open, and he moved like he was being dragged along on puppet strings. I picked up the walking stick and began to follow them. I wondered how much longer he had left in him, and what any of us could do if he just fell over and stopped walking. I wondered how much longer any of us had. I don't know how long we walked. Everything melted together in a muddled malaise at that time. I remember losing my footing and tripping a few times, but I barely felt it. The third time, I didn't even realize I was laying on the ground until Jessica stepped on me as she was passing by. There was no apology. She was too far gone to recognize that she had stepped on me. I dragged myself to my feet and felt lightheaded, but continued putting one foot in front of the other. The fifth time I fell, I wondered if it would have been better for me just to lay down and wait to die. An excited yap behind me from one of those things drove me to my feet. It wasn't until we bumped into the sign for Little Bear Canyon that I realized how close we were to salvation. The post for Little Bear Canyon also had a branching sign that pointed in the direction of TJ Coral, which was only a few miles from where we started at the Gila Cliff Dwellings, if we walked along Route 15. Ian was heading in the right direction, and we were almost home free. In my excitement, I began calling to the others to let them know that the end was near. I looked around me and shouted, "Jessica, Ian, Oliver, Heather, Amy, I know where we need to—" The words died on my lips as I counted the names, and I realized it wasn't over yet. The others kept moving as they hadn't heard me talking. The imposter shuffled alongside of us for once. It was easy to identify them. I don't know whether or not they had let down their guard after seeing our condition, but this one was obvious. She moved slowly, but her movements didn't convey her exhaustion. Everyone else was sweating and looking like the walking dead, but she was fine. I waited for her to get close enough to follow the trail the others were going down before I raised Ian's stick and growled, "Turn around right now. I can see you." She turned around slowly and I felt my heart skip a beat. She looked almost exactly like Jessica, except for a brown tinge in her hair. She could have been her twin. I knew what it was planning before it even opened its mouth and asked, "What are you doing, Evan?" "Don't call me that," I winced. "What are you rambling about? Please move out of the way. We're almost safe from those things." "I know what you are." Heather turned white at the realization. She began speaking quickly. "I'm not one of those things. Please, Evan, you have to remember, there were 6 of us. Those things want us to think there were only 5, so they can take one of us without the others caring. Those things don't want all of us. They only want the weakest one. Please, let's go before they catch—" "Shut up," I snapped. I raised the walking stick in my hand and I brandished it at her. Think about it, Evan. Do I move like those things? Do I speak like them? That should be enough to prove that I'm human. No, Ian's my brother, Jessica's girlfriend. I'm your girlfriend. I sat on your lap on the car ride. Please, don't kill me. Evan, I love you. Don't you remember? Evan, I love you. I lowered the stick that was in my hand as memories bombarded me. I had met her that one night when my brother forced me to go out to the club with them. Heather had been sitting at the bar all night drinking. It wasn't until she tried to stand up and fell into my arms that we actually talked. I remembered lazy Sundays in bed watching cheesy sci-fi movies. I remembered holding her close to me after making love and hearing her whisper sweet things into my ear. I remember our life together. I rasped, "Heather, I'm so sorry, I don't know." She cooed, Evan, it's not your fault. She went to touch me and I sprang back like I'd been bitten by a snake. The instant I heard those words, I knocked. The stick caught her unaware to the side of her face. I felt her jaw give under way the sudden force of my attack. She blared through broken teeth, "I love." The second strike dented her temple as the temporal bone shattered. She kept trying to talk, but it was too late and too much damage had been done. The door was shut to me now. I kept swinging the walking stick down on her head until it splintered and snapped. I looked up from her twitching body and saw my brother watching me in horror. "Heather, oh my goodness." I spoke through gritted teeth and regarded him with red-rimmed eyes. "Come on, we have to go." He went to keep talking, but I walked past him. I didn't have to explain it to him. He eventually ran ahead, invigorated with the prospect of finding rescue on the road. I looked behind me one last time. The last thing I saw was one of those things dragging away Heather's corpse. It looked emaciated and half mad with starvation. At that very moment, I wasn't afraid of the thing. I just felt pity. Whether or not it forced that emotion on me, I'll never know. I turned away and caught up with the others on Route 15. We were on the road for 15 minutes before we managed to flag down a car and an ambulance was called for us. The doctor said that our exposure to the elements, combined with the starvation, dehydration, triggered the auditory and visual hallucinations we had experienced. It's the typical response you'd be given after hearing the half-dead ramblings about creatures warping their flesh and our memories to drive us to the brink of death so they could prey on us when we were at our weakest. We spent a week there while receiving treatments, recounting our horrific experiences, and then subsequent psyche evaluations before we were released. I tried to talk to the others about it. Ian and Jessica refused to talk to me about it. I don't really know Oliver or Amy, so that's off the table too. They just want to forget. I can't forget. Here's the thing. I still remember Nadia asking me to help her find her lighter. I recall staying up late and talking with her by the campfire while she smoked like a chimney. I can recite Jerry's terrible puns that he'd make about almost everything, and Lucas's determination at hiking this trail while slowly succumbing to the effects of his multiple sclerosis. I can recall whispering sweet nothings to Jessica under the glow of the full moon. I can still envision that moment clear as day, even months later. I know that conversation we had, word for word. I can remember the feeling of her skin against mine, and the smell of her hair as I pressed myself against it when I reached that one true moment of connectivity. I remember Heather pleading and begging me not to kill her. Despite writing this months later, I can see all those things clearly, sometimes late at night. I can even remember driving up to the Gila National Park with Heather sitting on my lap, playfully grinding against me and telling me how much fun our hike was going to be. Sometimes I think about that memory more than I should. Since I can't talk to my brother or Jessica about this, I had to find some other outlet. I guess I'm writing all this out for that one reason, catharsis. In the end, I keep wondering if what I did was right. Did I make the right choice? I want you to read this and tell me that I had no other option, that the risk of one of them escaping into the city forced my hand. I know that's not the case. I could have always walked away or tried to scare her off, but I didn't. What kind of person can look into someone's eyes, remember all the things that they did and their life they had, and do what I did? Who can have all those memories and end everything so callously? It doesn't matter if none of it was real, because in that moment, it was to me. Who can look at someone and feel such love for them before you kill them? The answer to that question is simple, now that I ask myself aloud. I just don't like the answer. I am a private detective up in Canada. I am also a retired police officer. Having my own detective agency is nice. It allows me to be my own boss, set my own hours, and I can accept or decline any clients I choose. Most of the common cases I see are of people thinking that their spouses are unfaithful, or their business partner is trying to swindle money out of the company. The job can be difficult, especially when I have to confirm the suspicions of my customers. But that's just part of the job. Being up in Canada, we do get our fair share of missing persons. We do get a lot of tourists coming by trying to camp and hike in the woods nearby. If you don't know what you're doing, or you don't know where you are, it's very easy to get lost. People typically come to me with a missing persons case after the police had already looked into it. I'm kind of like the final resort. Because of this, I typically accept the case so I don't kill people's hopes. But unfortunately, I still have to make sure I get paid, regardless of the outcome. The scariest and most horrifying case I've ever encountered was 5 years ago. I remember that morning. It was cold and brisk. I pull into the parking lot at my office. There's a nice luxury car idling in the parking lot. It's 7 in the morning and my office doesn't open till 8. Most of my clients typically reach me by email or by phone. Very rarely do we actually meet face to face. I get out of my truck, walk to my office and unlock the front door. At the same time, someone in that luxury car steps out. An elderly gentleman with a nice suit jacket and hat approached me. The gentleman is easily in his 60s. We get to talking and he wants to put me on a case. Like most cases before this one, I want to hear the details before I actually accept it. The old man seemed worried about sharing the details of this case. That's never a good sign. He asked me a couple of times if I was easily spooked. I chuckled at his thought and I told him I wasn't. I had seen a lot of weird cases up to this point, but looking back, I had no idea what I was getting into. The man wanted to hire me to help find his missing daughter out in the woods. The daughter was in her mid-30s, and she was severely handicapped mentally and very violent. The old man suspected that the daughter was living out in a cabin in the woods. This cabin was inaccessible to roads, and it would require me to backpack for 2 days out in the woods. The old man warned me that the reason they stopped going to this cabin is that there was a religious cult nearby that was causing many issues. The cult was known for dressing in weird costumes while they committed vandalism and stole cattle. This cult sounded like anarchist hippies, which kinda made me laugh. The old man had finished telling me the details about the case, and I was about to decline when the man pulled out an envelope full of money. He handed it to me and I counted. It was roughly $10,000. The old man told me that he didn't want police involved. This was another red flag. The old man essentially said that he wanted me to hike 2 days up to the cabin and just make sure that she wasn't there, and if she was, that I had to bring her home. If I was able to do this, he'd pay me an extra $25,000 as a bonus. After hearing this, I obviously accepted the case. The man then handed me another envelope. This one was full of information, mostly coordinates to where I should hike in order to find this cabin. The envelope also contained photographs of his daughter. She had beautiful long black hair. You could even tell by the pictures that the woman was handicapped. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the envelope full of information. I routed my path in which I was going to take to get to this cabin. This cabin was in the middle of nowhere. This seemed really weird. How was a mentally handicapped woman able to get out to this cabin? She would definitely need help. What was this old man not telling me? Was she maybe kidnapped and brought there? Everything in my mind was telling me that this was a bad idea, but I was just so curious as to what was going on. I spent the next day preparing my backpack, and I left the day after. I arrived at the mouth of the trail early morning. The woods were dense and dark up until 10 a.m. The path was overgrown for the most part, but it was still visible. I spent the rest of the day hiking, and I somewhat enjoyed myself. If I wasn't so perplexed about this old man and what he wasn't telling me, I thought I'd be on vacation. I made camp early, and I settled in for the night. Nothing really seemed out of the ordinary. I made a campfire and I had dinner. Typically, the campfire drives away animals, but for some reason, I felt like I was drawing something in. I then began to feel what felt like the unseen eyes of a predator on me. I was definitely being watched, but I didn't know from where or from what. I decided to put out my fire and to go back into my tent. I kept my loaded handgun nearby. I didn't hear anything that night. That's not a good thing. Typically, you'll hear some bugs and animals, but I heard nothing. It was dead silent all night long. I didn't get much sleep that night. I woke up early and made some coffee in order to jumpstart my day. Once I got back on the trail, I seemed to forget what had happened the night before, and all things were back to normal. The animals and bugs were making noise again, which helped me relax. During my hike, I came across a very, very odd scene. Something I can honestly say I'd never seen before. It was this odd wooden structure made of sticks and stones. It kind of resembled an altar of some kind. My first thought was that I came across a site that belonged to the natives. Interesting, I thought. But then I remembered what the old man told me about the cult that lived in the woods. Oh boy. I kept my cool, and I just hoped that my first instinct was right, and I continued walking deeper and deeper into the woods. It wasn't too much later when I came across another odd sight out in the woods. This one clearly did not belong to any of the natives. The site that I came across was a small collection of cabins out in the woods. The cabins were clearly put together by power tools. My first thought was to go inspect the cabins and see if I could find anyone to talk to. I walked out into the open and I approached one of the cabins. The door to the first cabin was hanging on its hinge. I gently pulled on the door and the door fell over. I walked inside a few steps. I looked around and saw that the cabin was utterly destroyed. It looked as if a bear had gotten inside. I then briefly checked the other cabins, and they all looked very similar. I then inspected my map and checked to see where this old man's cabin was. It couldn't have been more than an hour or so away. So I got back to it, and I got back onto the trail. By this time, it was starting to get dark. I debated whether to keep going or to stop for the night and make a campfire. Considering all the things that I saw that day, I decided it would be best for me to hide in the woods and to stay overnight. I would not have a campfire, so I would not give away my position, and in the morning, I would continue searching for the cabin and for the lost girl. Looking back, this decision to stay overnight probably saved my life. Right around 9 o'clock, I started to drift off to sleep when I began to hear a weird sound coming from the woods. The sound was rhythmic, and it sounded as if it was pretty far away. Being a detective and genuinely a curious person, I decided to go investigate what that sound was. The woods were pitch black and the trees were dense. I made sure to leave a small light on in my tent just in case I got lost. I then went off into the woods, following the sound. The sound sounded as if a large drum was being played, but when I got closer, I was able to make out some chanting. After about 5 more minutes of walking, I was able to see a light. As I got closer to the light, I was able to make out a large field. What I'm about to describe to you is very difficult. It took my mind a couple of seconds to process what exactly I was seeing. In the middle of the field was a large bonfire with people surrounding it. The people were wearing dark robes and they were chanting around the bonfire. In between the people in robes and the bonfire looked like pigs running around in circles. Mind you, I was a good distance away and I was hiding in the tree line, but something kept telling me that something was off. The pigs running in circles looked weird. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the pigs just didn't move normally. After a few minutes, the chanting stopped, and at the same time, so did the pigs. To my horror and my sudden realization, I finally figured out why the pigs looked off. It was because the pigs were people, crawling around on the dirt, wearing pig masks. Once I realized this, I decided immediately to get out of there. I tried my best to stay calm, but I was completely terrified. I slowly backed away, trying my best not to make any sound. Once I was at a comfortable distance away, I started to sprint. The whole time I was sprinting back to my tent, I had the weird feeling that I was being followed. I knew deep down that they didn't see or hear me, but I still had that feeling. Once back in my tent, I grabbed my handgun again and I turned off all my lights. Right then and there, I debated with myself whether to keep going on with the case or to turn back. Deep down, something told me that this girl I was looking for was probably already gone. There's no way that she would have been able to survive out here, let alone with these people doing who knows what out in the woods. However, like I said, I'm a very curious person and I'm well armed. With that combination, I felt confident enough to stay and to check out the cabin just to make sure that she was actually gone. My plan was to wake up early the next morning, find the cabin, look for any sign of this girl, and get out of there before any of these cult people woke up. I admit, it probably wasn't the smartest choice, but I decided to stay. That night seemed to go on forever, and I didn't get any sleep. Again, the forest was silent, which is pretty unusual. I got up early the next morning, around 4 a.m. The only thing I brought with me was a flashlight and my pistol. I decided to leave my camp up. Carrying the extra gear would have just slowed me down, so I decided to worry about that later. I set out for the cabin. The morning was dark and the forest was pretty dense still. The trail I took passed by the open field that I saw last night. The field was empty, but I did see smoldering ash where the bonfire was. I passed quickly and continued my journey to the cabin. After what felt like an hour, I finally arrived to the man's cabin. The cabin was more like a house, and it looked to be intact for the most part. I approached the door and tried the handle. The door was unlocked, so I entered. I made sure I had my pistol drawn, and I made sure to be quiet because I didn't know exactly what I was going to find. The possibility that the cult members lived here now was pretty high, so I made sure to make my presence not known. I examined the bottom floor. There were a few items left out that looked like someone was actually living here, but who? The cabin had a second story, so I hesitantly went up the stairs. That's when I heard it. Someone was crying. By this time, the sun was starting to rise. The visibility was starting to clear, and my cover of darkness was now fleeting. I wanted to be in and out while it was still dark, so I made sure to hurry, but also stay quiet. I walked down the hallway to the room that had the crying. I slowly opened the door, and I was completely surprised at what I was looking at. Inside the room, on the bed facing away from me, was a woman. She had long dark hair, much like the girl in the picture, and my heart skipped a beat. I tried to grab her attention by calling out to her, but she just kept crying. That's when I noticed it. The crying seemed off. The crying kept repeating in the same pattern, as if it was a recording of some kind. I quickly walked into the room, touching her shoulder. The woman turned out to be a mannequin, and on her lap was a recording of the crying. This was a trap. My heart sunk into my stomach. I then heard what sounded like a four-wheeler off into the distance. It sounded as if it was getting closer. Instead of running out of the house, exposing myself, I decided to hide in the closet. The four-wheeler pulled up to the house, and it sounded like 3 men entered the cabin. I had my pistol drawn, pointing at the closet door. I could hear the 3 men talking downstairs, although not clearly. They were talking loudly, and they seemed upset. The 3 men then made their way upstairs. I could hear them much more clearly, and it sounded as if they were looking for someone. I assumed this someone to be me. The men then entered the room I was hiding in. One of the men was talking with someone else on a walkie-talkie. The man on the walkie-talkie said that he found my tent, but I wasn't inside, and that I couldn't be too far. The man then spoke into the walkie-talkie, saying, "Don't worry, we'll get him in the woods." The 3 men then finally left, though loudly, and they took off on the four-wheeler, leaving the mannequin and recording still playing. I waited in that closet for an hour. I wanted to make sure that whoever it was at the house was gone. By this time, the sun was completely up. I realized at this point I was not able to go back the way I came. I would have to take a detour about 5 miles out and circle back around back to the trail. This would cost me some very precious time and energy. But it would be a small price to pay not to be spotted by these people. I slowly left the closet, making my way downstairs into the doorway. The house and the nearby woods seemed to be empty, so I slowly left the house. I took off on a different path, leading me back. Like I said, the path back would be longer, but it would be different, making it much more difficult to track me. It was more than likely that these people were looking for me in the woods. I'm not exactly sure what they wanted with me, but I didn't want to find out. The next 2 days hiking back were terrible. I didn't have any food or shelter, and I tried to limit my stops to only 20 minutes. There were a couple of times in the woods I heard very loud squealing. I'm pretty sure the squealing I heard didn't come from actual pigs, but rather those people. Whenever I heard those sounds, I made sure to hide and stay out of sight. The squealing sounds would eventually fade off into the distance, and I would slowly get back to hiking. The nighttime was probably the worst. I would try my best to hike without my flashlight, but it would get to the point where it was near impossible, so I would just sit and rest. But I made sure to never fall asleep. After what seemed like forever, I would eventually make it back off the trail and back to the parking lot in which I parked my truck. I never did see that client that hired me for this job. I am pretty positive that he was a part of the cult that I saw out in the woods. I think that he tried to hire me to lure me out into the woods, either as a sport for his cult members, or to have me join them. Either way, the thought is pretty spooky. A couple of weeks later from this case, I did get a package. There was no return address, but I'm pretty sure it came from the old man. Inside the package were 2 items. The first item was a pig mask, much like the ones I saw the people wearing out in the woods. The second item was a note card with one word on it: Lucky. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'd share them here. I have been an SAR officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys might be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path, or slip down a small cliff and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old saying, "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander too far. But I have 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the next missing persons case I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came down to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked her where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by a bear man. She said that he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on his shoulders of the bear man, and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her and her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name, before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere and we never found a single trace of her. I have no idea where she could have possibly have gone, because neither her or her grandfather saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own, searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we usually find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she had killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We had found him trapped in a small crevice with a broken leg. It wasn't pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he's been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment and was wearing a parka with ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the other guy all night, climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. When we found her, she was curled up under a large rotten log. She was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base operations. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock, but the closer we got to base, the more agitated the woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at her. At one point she stopped and turned around and just started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with them, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. When we were within sight of the base, the woman turns to me, and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touched my shoulder and says, "He says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck." I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar, and I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she said that, I heard that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to the base, trying not to show how freaked out I was, but I have to say, I was really happy when we left that area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is even true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken, regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors, and at this point we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. On just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took a set of stairs in your house and cut them out and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officers told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. I have a lot more stories, and I suppose if anyone's interested, I'll tell some of them tomorrow. If anyone has theories about the stairs, or if you've seen them too, let me know. So, I logged back on tonight, and I was blown away by the staggering amount of interest this seemed to have generated. First off, I will address a few things that you guys have brought up. There's been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarities between some of my stories and those of Dave Paulides. I assure you, I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the guy. He's actually what inspired me to write this, because I can verify a lot of things he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing person cases, and most of the time they aren't solved. Either that or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few that I've seen, and a story my friend told me that relates to this. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on those briefly here, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new. I saw one set that looked like they came from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go infinitely, or farther than I can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house, as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't really promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of this peak, he saw another man in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. Alright, on to new stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls. People who've fallen down cliffs and hurt themselves, get injured by fires. You wouldn't believe how often this happens, mostly drunk kids. Get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases, where we never find any trace of them, so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for us all, because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone, or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio telling us to all head back to the vet's location, and we come right away, because this usually means that the missing person is injured and we need to make a full team to help get them to safety. We meet back up, and the vet is just standing at the base of the tree with his hands on the side of his head. I ask my buddy, "What's going on?" and he points up into the branches of the tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there was a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch, and it's just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see other signs that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious that no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring out our canines, but they lose his scent long before the tree. Eventually, the search is called off, because there are other calls that we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not much we can really do. The guy's wife calls us every day for months, asking if we found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call, in particular, was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That, and the questions that were raised. How the hell did this guy's cane end up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one, from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under, it's never easy, and we always dread the ones that we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulides talks a lot about kids SAR teams find in places they shouldn't be, or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I will share one of the ones that I think about a lot, that I witnessed personally. A mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in that area either, which is important. She packed their stuff up and started to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking lot area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path, like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like someone coming from the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 seconds or so that she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figured he stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she's asking her other 2 kids where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand, and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it all seemed like they'd been drugged. They're sort of spacey and fuzzy, so of course she freaks out, starting looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she hears him answer her. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got the other 2 kids. So she calls the police, and they send us out immediately. We respond, and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes, or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by this whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks with a lot of volunteers' help, but eventually, the search peters out, and we have to move on. The volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us about this location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there, about 15 miles from the site where he'd vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. A volunteer just happened to be in the area, because he figured that he might as well look in places no one else would think to look, on the off chance the body has been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, and sure enough, it's the body of the little boy. Stuffed in a little opening in the rock, he recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in, and we're dispatched. It took us about an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. The slope is treacherous, and it's hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there. Of that, I am certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him. His shoes are gone, but his feet aren't damaged or dirty, so it wasn't as if an animal had dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't even been dead for that long. He'd been out there for over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or 2. The whole thing was unbelievably strange, and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined that the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I have ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search operation for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mother. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him, because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about a half mile from where he'd last been seen. The kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered off that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for, because I was really not good with kids and I find it really hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me where one of the hot spots is, where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out of there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about half an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, I see something in the distance. Now this area we are in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there are back roads that you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far. But we're on a state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or a makeshift shelter that homeless people think that they can get away with building. But I can see from here that whatever this thing is, it has straight edges. And if there's one thing that you'll learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I point it out, but she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all of the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase in the middle of the woods. In proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It was just a normal staircase with beige carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it was out in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood that it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try to make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there, casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her, "What is going on out here?" And she just chuckles. "Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna have to see a lot of them." I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm, hard. "I wouldn't do that," she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight. And I just stand there looking at her. "You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them. Don't go up them. Just ignore them." I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20 or 30 miles out, literally in the middle of nowhere. And I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for miles. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I've ever seen looked like they came out of the turn-of-the-century mansion, and they were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal. Don't go close to them, or up them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I'll get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one of those less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter, when realistically no one should be going out that far out onto the trails. We closed a lot of them, but some remained open year-round, unless there's a ton of snow. We did opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground, and we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. We found him at the base of a tree, in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the living crap out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard, or may have spent any time out on a mountain, will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in areas beneath branches. It happens most with fir trees, because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of the tree that's filled with a mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put signs up in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are. But every year that we get an unusual amount of snow, at least one person doesn't read them, or doesn't take them seriously, and we find out in the spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired, or maybe had a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck in with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen but in deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scares me the most was imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down, in the freezing cold. He didn't die quickly. The snow would have formed a dense and heavy pile on top of him, and would have literally felt impossible to get out. As it was harder and harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the Goat Man while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, I guess fortunately, I've never seen anything quite like that. I guess the closest was the whole black eye man thing, but I didn't ever see anything. However, there was this one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the Goat Man. We'd gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hiked up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs to us, and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her and she's passed out on the trail. We get her on board, and as we're getting her down to the Welcome Center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what had happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was this. She'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow, and she couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try to hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was, until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part, because it was so weird that I don't think I could ever forget it, even if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man, she said. The man kept saying the word meow over and over, just meow, meow, meow. But it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it and it sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was, and the last thing I remember was the shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now obviously I'm a little perplexed as to why this guy came out of the woods chanting meow meow at people. So once we got down the mountain, I told my superior that I'm going back to search the area to see if I could find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile more, and when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I could figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset at this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it out again tomorrow. But as I'm heading back, I start to hear something in the distance. I stop and I call out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow meow in this really odd monotone. As comical as it makes it sound, it was almost like the guy on South Park with the electrolarynx, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get any closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I end up going back to the Welcome Center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there effing with people, but even I have to admit that it was pretty weird. So this kind of thing turned out to be a massive wall of text, and I apologize for that. I wanted just to get these stories out that my friend told me, and he does have some good ones, so I'll post those tomorrow evening. I also have a few more of my own I think you guys would like. I'm sorry to keep you all in suspense again. Hopefully these stories are here to make up for it and are able to help you get through the next 24 hours until I can post again. Well, once again, you guys have blown me away with your staggering amount of responses to my stories. There's no way I can respond to each of you individually, so I'm just going to address some of the common things again and then move on to the stories. I'm going to write as many as I can think of in addition to my friend's stories, and I will probably not update again until I get a chance to answer some of the questions that I myself have for my superiors. Alright, so the common questions I found that you all had. I'm not comfortable talking about where exactly I work. Unfortunately, in all reality, some of the things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble, or fired, so it's best that I don't discuss too much. I will say that I am in the United States and in an area that is comprised of a great deal of wilderness, while taking hundreds of miles of thick forest with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs, and luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll be very interested in. I'll go into it more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I've ever thought of asking my superiors about them, I have, but again, I don't want to risk my job over it. However, one of my former superiors no longer works with the search and rescue office, and it is possible that he would be willing to talk to me about it. I will be speaking to him later in the week, and I will let you know what comes of that. As far as advice on becoming a search and rescue officer, I think the best advice I can give is to contact your local Forest Service office and see if there's any offerings of training courses or what the qualifications are. I have been doing this for years, and I've started out as a volunteer, helping out S&R operations. It's a great job, despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. Alright, let's move on to the stories. The first thing happened on a case that I went out right after I was out of training, and was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I had basic idea of what to expect. But on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets had found signs of them, and as a search and rescue officer, you go out of all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called in early in the morning from a young couple who were up on one of the trails that goes by the lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. We could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we got there, we see him holding his wife, and she's got something in her arms. She's screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he's sobbing. He sees us, and he's screaming at us to come and help them, to please get an ambulance up there. Now obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up to the walking path, so we ask him if he and his wife need any help, or if she can walk on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over, and one of the vets is trying to calm him down, and I ask the wife, what's going on? She's rocking, holding something, and just shrieking over and over. I crouch down and see whatever she's holding. It's covered with her blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front, and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms gently open so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby. Obviously, dead. His head is caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation hit me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself, and I get up and go over to one of the other vets, who were standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of pats me on the shoulder and tells me that he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us even see her kid. Every time we try to take him away from her, she flips out and tells us that we can't have him, that he'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But eventually, one of the vets managed to calm her down, and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when we found the EMTs show up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from the trauma to his head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and she told me later what had happened. Turns out this couple had been walking with their baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. The dad takes the kid out and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes next to him and stands there, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil and she trips. She falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling down 20 feet down this little gully onto rocks at the bottom. The dad climbed down and recovered the kid, but he'd fallen right on his head and was dead by the time he got there. The baby was about 15 months old. It was just a total freak accident. A series of events that just coalesced into this worst possible outcome. Probably one of the most awful calls I'd ever been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as a search and rescue officer, mostly because there aren't that many animals that come around the area. While there are bears in the area, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are the small ones, like coyotes or raccoons, skunks even. What we do see frequently, though, are moose, and let me tell you, moose are pretty nasty. They'll chase after anything for any reason, and God help you if you get in between one of them and their babies. One of the most amusing calls was a guy who had gotten chased down by an absolutely massive male moose and was stuck up a tree. It took us almost an hour to get him down. And when he was finally on solid ground again, damn, those things are big up close. I guess that's not really a scary story, but we still laugh about that one. I honestly don't know how I'd forgotten this story, but it is, by far, the scariest thing that has happened to me. I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget that it just didn't come to my mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time out in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone, or out in the middle of nowhere. That's when you have experiences like this. You tend just to forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that has ever made me really seriously consider if this job is right for me. I don't really like talking about it much, but I'll do my best I can do to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent and told us what most parents do. My kid would never wander away, and she was so good about staying close. She's never done anything like this before. We assured the parents that we'll do everything we can to find her, and we spread out in a standard search formation. I was partnered up with one of my good buddies, and we were sort of casually holding conversation while we hiked. I know it sounds a little bit callous, but you do sort of become desensitized to what you've done this long. It becomes norm, and I think to a certain extent, you have to learn to desensitize yourself in order to work this job. We search for a good 2 hours, going well beyond where we think she could be, and we come out of this small valley where something makes us both stop in unison. We freeze and look at each other, and there's almost a sensation like a plane depressurizing. My ears pop. I have this odd sensation of having dropped about 10 feet. I start to ask my buddy if he felt that, but before I can, we hear the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. It's almost like a freight train passing directly by us, but it's coming from every direction at once, including above and below us. He screams something to me, but I can't hear him over the deafening roar. Understandably freaked out, we look all around us, trying to find the source of the sound, but neither of us sees anything. Of course, my buddy thought, this is a landslide, but we're not near any cliffs, and even if we were, it would have hit us by now. The sound goes on, and we're trying to yell to each other, but even standing close together, we can't hear anything but this sound. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stops, like someone threw a switch and cut it off. We stand there for a second, perfectly still, and slowly, the normal sounds of the woods come back. He asks me, what the F just happened? I just kind of shrug, and we stand there looking at each other for a minute. I get on the radio and ask if anyone had just heard the end of the effing world, but no one else hears it, even though we were all within shouting distance of each other. My buddy and I just sort of shrug it off and keep going. About an hour later, we all check up on the radios, and no one's found the little girl. Most of the time, we won't search when it gets dark, but because we don't have any kind of lead on her, a few of us decide to keep going, including me and my buddy. We keep getting closer, and we're calling out for her every couple of minutes. At this point, I'm hoping beyond hope that we find her, because while I may not like kids, the idea of them being out in the woods all alone is awful. The woods can be intimidating to kids in the daylight. At night, well, it's a whole different beast. But what we're not seeing any signs of her, or getting any responses, and around midnight, we decide to turn around and head back to the rendezvous point. We're about halfway back when my buddy stops and shines his light to the right of us, into a really thick deadfall, or a group of dead trees. I ask him if he's heard a response, but he just told me to be quiet and listen for a second. I do, and in the distance, I can hear what sounds like a kid crying. We both call the girl's name and listen for any kind of response, but it's just this really faint crying. We head in the direction of this deadfall and go around it, calling her name over and over. As we get closer to the crying, I start getting this weird feeling in my gut. And I tell my buddy that something isn't right. He tells me he feels the same way, but we can't figure out what it is. We stop where we are and call the girl's name again, and at the same time, we both figure it out. The crying is on a loop. It's the same little hitching sob, then wail, then quiet hiccup, repeated over and over. It's exactly the same every time, and without saying another word, we both take off running. It's the only time I've ever lost my composure like that, but something about it was so incredibly wrong, and neither of us wanted to stay out there anymore. When we got back to the rendezvous, we asked if anyone else had heard anything strange, but no one else knew what we were talking about. I know it sounds sort of anticlimactic, but it kinda effed me up for a long time. As for the little girl, we never found a trace of her. We kept an eye out for her and all the other people who we've never found, but frankly, I doubt we'll ever find anything. Of the missing persons call I've gone out on, only a handful have ever resulted in a complete disappearance, meaning no trace of the person and nobody ever found. But sometimes finding a body just leads to more questions than answers. Here are some of the bodies we've found that have become infamous in our team. A teenage boy whose remains were recovered almost a year after he'd vanished. We found the top of his skull, 2 finger bones, and a camera almost 40 miles from where he was last seen. The camera was sadly destroyed. The pelvis of an older man who had vanished a month earlier. That's all that was found. A lower jaw and a right foot of a 2-year-old boy on the highest peak of a ridge in the southern part of a park. The body of a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome, almost 20 miles from where she'd vanished. She had died of exposure, 3 weeks after going missing, and all of her clothes were intact except for her shoes and jacket. There were berries and cooked meat in her stomach when they did the autopsy. The coroner said it appeared as if someone had been taking care of her. There were no suspects ever identified. The frozen body of a 1-year-old baby found a week after vanishing in a hollow tree trunk 10 miles from the area he was last seen in. There was fresh milk found in his stomach, but his tongue was gone. A single vertebrae and a right kneecap of a 3-year-old girl found in the snow almost 20 miles from the campground her family had been previously camping at that summer. Now on to a couple of stories my friend told me. I mentioned that you were all interested in the stairs, and you're in luck. He's had a bit of a closer encounter with them, though he doesn't have any explanation for them. He does have a bit more experience with them than I do. My buddy had been a search and rescue officer for about 7 years. He started when he was a junior in college, and he had a very similar experience when he first encountered the stairs. His trainer told him almost the same thing mine did, which was never to go near them, touch them, or even ascend them. For the first year he did just that, but apparently his curiosity got the better of him, and on one of the calls he broke away from the line and went to go check a set of them. He said that they were about 10 miles from the path where a teenage girl had vanished, and the dogs were following a scent. He was on his own, lagging behind the main group, when he saw a set of stairs off to his left. They looked like they were from a new house because the carpeting was pristine and white. He said as he got closer, he didn't feel any different, or heard any weird noises. He was expecting something to happen, like bleeding from his ears or collapsing. But he got right up next to them, and didn't feel anything. The only thing he said that was odd about the whole thing was there was no debris of the steps. No dirt, no leaves, no dust, nothing. And there didn't appear to be any signs of animals or insects activity in the area, which he did find strange. It was less like things were avoiding them, and more like they just happened to be in a relatively barren part of the forest. He touched the stairs, and didn't feel anything except the sort of sticky feeling you get from a new carpet. Making sure his radio was on, he slowly climbed the stairs. He said it was terrifying, because the way they'd been stigmatized, he wasn't really sure what was going to happen to him. He joked that half of him expected to be teleported into another dimension, and the other half was watching for a UFO to come swooping down. But he got to the top with a little event, and he stood there, looking around. But he said the longer he stood on the top step, the more he felt like he was doing something very, very wrong. He described it as the feeling you get if you were in a part of a government building you have no business in being in. As if someone was going to come and arrest you, or shoot you in the back of the head at any second. He tried to brush it off, but the feeling got stronger and stronger, and that's when he realized he couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds of the forest were gone, and he couldn't hear his own breathing. It was like some kind of weird, awful tinnitus, but more oppressive. He climbed back down and rejoined the search, and didn't mention what he'd done. But he said the weirdest part came after. His trainer was waiting back at the welcome center after the search ended for the day, and he cornered my buddy before he could leave. He said that his trainer had this look of immense anger, and that he asked what was wrong. "You went up them, didn't you?" My buddy said it wasn't phrased as a question. He asked how his trainer knew. The trainer just shook his head. "Because we didn't find her. The dogs just lost her scent." My buddy asked what that had to do with anything. The trainer asked how long he'd been on the stairs. My buddy said no more than a minute. The trainer gave him this really awful, almost dead-eyed look, and told him that if he ever went up this set of stairs again, he'd be fired. Immediately. The trainer walked away, and I guess he never answered any of the questions my buddy had asked him about it since. My buddy had been involved in a lot of missing persons cases where there's never been a trace of them found. I mentioned David Paulides, and my buddy said that he confirmed that those stories are for the most part, accurate. He said that most of the time, if the person isn't found right away, they're either never found, or they're found weeks, months, or even years later, in places they can't possibly have gotten to. One of the stories he told me stood out, and it involved a 5-year-old boy with a severe mental disability. The little boy vanished from a picnic area in the late fall. In addition to the mental disability, he was also physically handicapped, and his parents explained over and over that he simply could not have vanished. It was impossible. Someone had to have taken him. My buddy said that they searched for this kid for weeks, going miles out of the accepted range, but it was like they'd never been there at all. The dogs couldn't pick up a scent anywhere, not even in the picnic area where he'd apparently vanished from. Suspicion fell on the parents, but it was pretty clear that they were devastated and haven't done anything sinister to their kid. The search was concluded about a month later, and my buddy said everyone had pretty much forgotten about it by later in the winter. He was out on a training operation in the snow, on one of the highest peaks, when he came across something in the snow. He said he saw it far away at first, and when he got closer, he realized it was a shirt, frozen and sticking part way out of the powder. He recognized it as belonging to the kid, because it had a distinctive pattern. About 20 yards away, he found the kid's body, lying partially buried in the snow. My buddy said that there was no way the kid had been dead for more than a few days, even though he'd been missing for about 3 months. The kid was curled around something, and when my buddy brushed it off the snow to see what it was, he said he couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a big chunk of ice that had been carved crudely to look like some kind of person. The kid was holding it so tight that he'd gotten frostbitten from his chest and hands, which my buddy could tell, even with the decay that had taken place. He radioed the rest of the crew, and they took the body off the mountain. Now, he recapped all of this for me, and to put it simply, there's no physical way this child could have survived almost 3 months on his own or have gotten to this peak. There was no physical way that this child could have walked 50 miles and ended up on top of a mountain. To top it off, there was nothing in this kid's stomach or colon. Nothing, not even water. It was like my buddy said, the kid had been taken off the face of the earth, put in suspended animation, and dropped on this mountain months later, only to die of exposure. He's never really gotten over that one. The last story I'll share from him was the one that took place relatively recently, only a few months ago. They were out doing a recon for mountain lions, because there had been several reports of sightings in the last couple of days. One of our jobs is to scout out the areas where these animals are seen to ensure that they are in the area. We can't warn people and close off the trails. He was out on his own in a very heavily forested part of the park towards dusk when he heard the sound of what sounded like a woman screaming in the distance. Now, as most of you know, when a mountain lion screams, it sounds almost exactly like a woman being brutally murdered. It's unsettling, but far from abnormal. My buddy radioed back and let the operation management know that he's heard one, and that's when he was going to keep going to see if he could figure out where its territory started. He heard the mountain lion scream a couple more times, always from the same spot, and determined that approximate area of the mountain lion's territory. He was about to head back when he heard another scream, this time within only a few yards of him. Of course, he freaks out and starts heading back at a much faster pace, because the last thing he wants to do is to run into a damn mountain lion and get mauled to death. As he gets back on the path and starts heading back, the screaming follows him, and he broke into a jog. When he was about a mile away from operations headquarters, the screaming stopped, and he turned around to see what it was that was following him. It was almost night at this point, but he said in the distance, just before the path rounded the corner, he could see what looked like a male figure. He called out to them, warning them that the paths were closed, and that he needed to come back to the welcome center. The figure just stood there, and my buddy started to walk over. When he was about 10 yards away, the figure took, as he described, an impossibly long step towards him and let out that same scream my buddy had been hearing. My buddy didn't even say anything. He just turned and sprinted back to the operations headquarters, never looking behind him. By the time he got back, the screaming moved back into the woods. He didn't mention it to anyone, just said that there was a mountain lion in the area and that they would need to close the pass until the animal could be located and moved. I'm going to end this entry here, since it turned into a huge wall of texts. I'm going to be headed out on a yearly training operations tomorrow morning, so I'll be gone until early next week. I'll be meeting with a lot of former trainers and buddies who worked in the other areas of the park. I'll be asking around about any stories they'd like to share. I'm so glad you guys like these stories and find them interesting. And once I'm back from this operation, I'll be sure to continue to share them. Hey guys, I'm back from my training op, and I have a lot of really interesting stories to share with you. I've got enough that I'm going to break them up into 2 parts, this being the first. I'd love to put them all out here on one entry, but I haven't had the chance to write them all down yet. I haven't had anything too crazy happen while I was out there, but we did have one incident with a rookie that I found relevant. Since I'm sure you guys have been wanting these for some time, I'll just get right into these stories. I'll assign each batch of stories to the person who told them to me. KD. KD is a vet who's an SAR officer for about 15 years. She specializes in high elevation mountain rescues and is widely considered as one of the best in her field. She was one of the more enthusiastic storytellers, and since we were here together, she ended up telling me about 4 of the stories that really stuck with me. The first one she told me in response to my asking about her most traumatic call. She shook her head and told me that really bad calls happen more frequently on the mountain, since the potential for nasty accidents is higher. About 5 years ago, one of the parks she worked with had a string of disappearances. It was a bad year, she said, one of the worst on record as far as weather went. They were getting about a foot of snow each and every day, and there was about a few avalanches that killed some climbers. They've warned people about staying on the mapped areas, but of course there are always those who didn't listen. One in particular nasty case, an entire family got wiped out because the father decided that he knew better than the officials, and he took them out into an area that wasn't safe. They were snowshoeing, and as best as KD could figure, they walked into a shelf of snow and looked solid, but actually wasn't. It gave way, and this family went head over heels about 300 feet down a slope. They landed on these rocks at the bottom, and the parents died instantly. One of the kids did as well, but the other 2 survived. One had a broken leg and fractured ribs. The other was almost unharmed, save for some bruising and a sprained ankle. The uninjured child left his sibling behind and set out to find help. KD said that this kid didn't make it more than a mile before the storm overtook him. The kid stops to try to get warm, or maybe just tries to rest, and ended up freezing to death. They ended up finding the family with the help of some witnesses who saw them heading out into the wilderness, and she was the one to find the kid who'd frozen to death, looking for help. She said it had started to snow, and just enough to obscure long-distance vision, but not enough to make searching impossible. She saw a figure sitting in the snow up ahead, and she got to it as quickly as possible. She described in detail how as she got closer, she realized first that it was a child, and second that they were deceased. Third, that they were frozen in one of the most painful, pitiful positions that she'd ever found a corpse in. The kid was sitting upright with his knees tucked into his chest. His arms were curled around them and his head was tucked in up into his coat. When she moved the coat to look at his face, she saw that he had died, crying. His face was twisted and the tears were frozen on his cheeks. She said it was painfully obvious that the kid was terrified when he succumbed to the hypothermia. As a mother, it broke her heart. She told me that, repeatedly, that she hopes that the father is burning in hell as we speak. The other traumatic story that she told me stood out in my mind was the one that happened where she was a rookie. Her team got a report of an